Yes.
Right. Well, the place that's pictured here is Ashton Villa, which is a house built not too long before the Civil War in Galveston, Texas. So that's the place we're talking about just now. And the date in question, of course, was June 19th, 1865. Nearly 2.5 years before, on January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had gone into effect, declaring, quote, "forever free all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States." Now, that last clause means that in practical terms, that hadn't immediately freed a single enslaved person in Texas or anywhere else in the parts of the Confederacy not yet reoccupied by the Union. But the American Civil War raged on, and the Union's armies fought on, bolstered by the enlistment of 179,000 African-American men in the United States colored troops, 179,000, including 94,000 from the southern states. 2.5 months before, on April 9th, 1865, in far-off Appomattox, Virginia, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had begun the end of the war by surrendering his army, and 2.5 weeks before, on June 2nd, at Galveston, General Edmund Kirby Smith had surrendered the last major Confederate army still in the field. So now on that June 19th, all eyes were on Union Major General Gordon Granger, the newly arrived military governor of Texas, as he and his staff read aloud his General Order Number 3 to the black and white people of Galveston. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Now, General Granger's proclamation had gone beyond that of Abraham Lincoln, not only declaring that, quote, all slaves are free, the Emancipation Proclamation has said the same, but also declaring absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. So that's kind of a key word as I researched this, learned a little bit more about it. As you heard, my work's primarily on the British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. So I had to hit the books a little bit for this. But absolute equality is what stood out to me from that order. Now, on the other hand, as radical as absolute equality might have sounded, he did also state that in practical terms, the formerly enslaved persons would now become, quote, hired labor, most likely remaining quietly at their present homes and therefore most likely seeking to earn wages from their erstwhile enslavers. The redistribution of land ownership to free people, suggested in the famous 40 acres and a mule clause of General William Tecumseh Sherman's Field Order Number 15, as his army marched through Georgia in January of 1865, was not put on the table by General Granger's order in Texas in June 1865. General Order Number 3 nonetheless touched off rejoicing among the black people of Galveston and throughout Texas, but rejoicing that was often tempered by the barely disguised disgust of the white people of Galveston and of Texas. Some celebrants were whipped, and one freed woman at Huntsville to the north of Houston was even attacked and wounded by a swordsman on horseback for having the temerity to celebrate her freedom. John Mosley, when questioned by a writer for the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s about his long ago memories of slavery and emancipation, talked of leaping into the air with joy when his enslaver told him the news, only to be brought back down by several quick pistol shots between his legs and a warning that further demonstrations would be met with one between the eyes. These stories are recounted in what is still the standard work on Texas slavery since its publication in 1989, Randolph B. Campbell's An Empire for Slavery, a Peculiar Institution in Texas. And Campbell's title is apt, For much of the Anglo population of Texas had come there in the first place over the previous 45 years because they were convinced that the vast land would indeed be an empire for slavery. When Stephen F. Austin led the group of immigrants from the United States known as the Old 300 Families to begin their first colony in Texas in 1821, the area was part of the brand new Republic of Mexico, which had just won its independence from Spain after a decade of war. So these are folks from the United States immigrating into Mexico. Slavery had been legal in the old Spanish Empire, and there had been a significant Black presence in the central area of Spanish Mexico. But the desire for liberty that had driven Mexico's War of Independence also created anti-slavery sentiment among the new republic's leaders. Many of Stephen F. Austin's followers nonetheless brought enslaved African Americans with them on their immigrants' journey from the United States into Mexican Texas. Austin himself was an enslaver. And though he wasn't sure when he first settled in Texas what role slavery would have in its development, by 1833, his experience of a Texas economy powered by slave labor had convinced him that, quote, Texas must be a slave country. Circumstances and unavoidable necessity compels it. It is the wish of the people there, and it is my duty to do all I can prudently in favor of it. Although at various times between 1821 and 1836, the Mexican government passed laws restricting slavery throughout the Republic, Austin and his friends were always able to negotiate exemptions for Texas. When rebellion against Mexican rule broke out in 1835 among those then known as Texians, these Anglo immigrants from the United States, then living in Texas, so they called themselves Texians at the time, slavery was not the immediate cause. A dispute over tax collection was. However, tax revolts usually have a lot to do with the basic organization of the underlying economy. And as Randolph Campbell argues, the Texas War of Independence was no exception. In a startling echo of arguments that would have reappeared during the American Civil War, Texians argued that Mexican federal troops were invading Texas in part with the aim to, quote, put their slaves free and then loosed upon their families, as one Texian put it in an open letter. The famous battles of the Alamo, Goliad, and San Jacinto followed, and victory gave the Texians the opportunity to write a new constitution and enshrine the principles by which their newly independent Republic of Texas would operate. Slavery was handled in what I pictured here, Section 9 of the 1836 Constitution's general provisions. The relevant section for our purposes here reads, all persons of color who were slaves for life previous to their immigration to Texas and who are now held in bondage shall remain in the like state of servitude. Congress shall pass no laws that prohibit immigrants from the United States of America from bringing their slaves into the Republic with them and holding them by the same tenure by which such slaves were held in the United States. Section 9 went on to state that an enslaver could only emancipate his slaves with specific permission from the Congress of Texas, and that congressional approval was also necessary for any, quote, free person of African descent to live in Texas. White Texians considered the presence of free Black people to be an unacceptable challenge to the principle that Black people were made by God and nature to be slaves. Now, when the United States annexed Texas in 1845, slavery remained legal under the new state Constitution of Texas. Now, both before and after this, enslaved people came to Texas, either accompanying their enslavers as they also relocated to Texas. So that's one way they get there, with the people who claim to own them, or via the interstate slave trade that moved enslaved persons by the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates are up to 1 million moved from the older slave states on the Atlantic coast. So this map kind of gives you the sense of that, down to the newer ones on the Gulf Coast. Particularly in the latter case, they often carried the memory of friends and family from whom they had been forced to part, and usually could not expect to see again in this life. As Frederick Douglass observed, this was a, quote, murderous traffic, in which he saw, quote, the tenderest ties ruthlessly broken to gratify the lust, caprice, and rapacity of the buyers and sellers of men. Now, after emancipation, freed people placed advertisements in newspapers across the country in hopes of restoring these ties, such as this one placed in the Christian Recorder all the way up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1896 by Jake Thomas, a black man living in Hill County in central Texas. Information wanted of Henry and Caroline Turner. They were raised with me and owned by John Thomas. We were separated in 1855. When last heard of, Caroline was in Missouri. I was sold from my mother when I was 2 years old. When 8 years old, I came to Texas and have been here ever since. Now, many have observed that the legends of Texas portray it primarily as part of the Wild West, rather than as an old South plantation state. Hollywood movies in particular tell us a primarily postbellum story, having to do with West Texas mostly, with cowboys and Indians, gunslingers, oilmen. Perhaps one thinks, as I do, of John Wayne in The Searchers. And of course, there he is. Texas, before the Civil War, however, had the bulk of both its black and white population in its eastern counties, pictured here on the map. And the U.S. Census of 1860 counted some 182,566 enslaved persons in Texas. So let me give you that number again, 182,566. And throughout the Civil War, the population would grow as well because so many people were refugeeing out of the other southern states as the Northern Army invested them and come into Texas with the people they enslaved. Now, as vast as Texas was, though, one newspaperman there estimated in the late 1850s that there was land enough to employ more than 10 times that many. The slaves that actually were present in Texas were made to work the same cash crops as the rest of the South. Sugarcane in some select areas of the Gulf Coast. There's a suburb of, I think, Houston called Sugarland, and that name's meaningful. They were growing sugarcane there, but cotton above all. And the productivity of enslaved persons in Texas meant that each enslaved person was valued at roughly $765. That's the price on the average enslaved person in Texas. Or if you multiply that times that number I gave you a moment ago, a total of about $140 million in 1860 and in 1860 dollars. This it was that the enslavers of Texas were determined to fight for when they joined 6 other southern states in the first round of secessions from the United States in 1861. The words of the Texas Declaration of Causes for the secession left no doubt that the defense of slavery was the single most important among those causes. So to quote from it, Texas was received as a commonwealth holding and maintaining and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery. That was the term they gave to it. The servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that had existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, in which her people intended should exist in all future time. Now, the northern states, on the other hand, had come under the control of abolitionists on this point of view, motivated by, now quoting again, the unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debasing doctrine of the equality of all men, irrespective of race or color. They call this a debasing doctrine, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of the divine law. And also in an inversion of Thomas Jefferson's famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence. Now let's remember, Thomas Jefferson himself was an enslaver all his life, and yet he did write those words that all men are created equal. Well, the Texans declared instead that we hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states and of the Confederacy itself were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior independent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable, that in this free government all white men are and of right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights, that the servitude of the African race as existing in these states is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator, as recognized by all Christian nations, while the destruction of the existing relations between the two races, as advocated by our sectional enemies, would bring inevitable calamities upon both and desolation upon the 15 slaveholding states. So that's the arguments that they gave for why they were leaving the Union at that point and joining the Confederacy. Now, I offer this sketch of the history of slavery in antebellum Texas and these odious excerpts from his 1861 Declaration of Why It Was Seceding to give you a sense of just how radical was General Granger's proclamation that, quote, all slaves are free, and that from then on there would be, quote, an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. This is a complete 180. Now, that said, as we all know, absolute equality was an aspiration. It was far easier to state than to make real. After the defeat of federally enforced Reconstruction throughout the South, Texas, like the other ex-Confederate states, condemned its Black population to the inequalities of the Jim Crow regime, backed by the racial terror of lynching. Between 1885 and 1942, some 339 African Americans were lynched in Texas, and their fate was publicized as a warning to other Black Texans not to question the unequal laws and customs under which they lived. Now, on a more mundane level, Black Texans, like other Black Southerners, possess little ability to choose their employers or bargain for better wages. Indeed, that part of the situation began to change only when Black Texans began to disregard General Granger's advice, quote, to remain quietly at their present homes, and instead began during the first half of the 20th century to seek new homes and employment in the North and the West, the movement we call the Great Migration. And that is how Juneteenth first came to the Tri-Cities. When the Hanford Project began in 1943, many of those who moved to this desolate part of the country to do construction and general labor were Black Southerners, including a large contingent of Black Texans. Now, the set of those that I know most about from family stories, from Aunt Vanessa and others, is the set that came from Cass County, including the small town of Kildare in the northeastern part of Texas. Now, as suggested by the title of the article by Robert Bauman of WSU Tri-Cities, Jim Crow in the Tri-Cities, 1943 to 1950, the new Black arrivals to the area encountered many of the same difficulties here that they would have been sadly familiar with in Texas. But they also brought some cultural resources to help them cohere as a community and to resist the attempt to force them into mental subordination. And among these was the celebration of Juneteenth. Now, in her great book on the Great Migration, The Want of Other Sons, Isabel Wilkerson similarly writes that the people from Texas took Juneteenth Day to Los Angeles, Oakland, Seattle, and other places they went. Indeed, Quintard Taylor, a historian for a long time up at the University of Washington, wrote in his book, The Forging of a Black Community, Seattle Central District from 1870 through the Civil Rights era, he documented that Juneteenth celebrations in the Seattle date back as far as 1890. Now, I can't say for sure when Juneteenth was first celebrated in Tri-Cities. I'm hoping Aunt Vanessa or Uncle Leonard can fill us in on that. I don't know what the early celebrations consisted of, but I do know that when my family first moved, Daddy moved us back to his hometown when he got out of the Air Force, moved us back to Richland in 1993. One of the first things we did that summer of 93 was attended the Juneteenth observance at Kurtzman Park, there in the historically Black community of East Pasco. Now, by that time, Juneteenth had begun to receive official recognition in several states, but first of all in Texas. As early as 1938, Governor James V. Allred issued a proclamation of June 19th as Emancipation Day and wrote that he do urge all members of the Negro race in Texas to observe the day in a manner appropriate to its importance to them. Though Allred notably did not suggest that the day carried any particular importance for Texans of other races. But then in 1979, thanks to the sponsorship of Al Edwards, a veteran of the civil rights movement, first elected to represent Houston in the state legislature the year before in 1978, and there's a statue of him, but he sponsors the Texas bill that makes Juneteenth an official state holiday. So Texas is where it starts. Texas is the first one to officially recognize it. By the year 2000, states of Oklahoma, Florida, and Minnesota had joined Texas. In 2007, the state of Washington first officially recognized Juneteenth. And earlier this year right now, a bill passed to make Juneteenth a paid day off for state employees. Now at present, Juneteenth is an officially observed day in 47 states and the District of Columbia. Only yesterday, the United States Senate unanimously, United States Senate did something unanimously. They passed a bill to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. And the bill is expected to receive House and presidential approval shortly. Now, Annette Gordon-Reed, the Texan historian and legal scholar, who's the world's foremost expert on the life and times of Thomas Jefferson, writes in her essential new collection of essays entitled On Juneteenth, that she was, quote, initially annoyed, at least mildly so, when I first heard that others outside of Texas claimed the holiday. On further reflection, Gordon-Reed recognized the increasingly widespread observance of Juneteenth as, quote, evidence that our country was leaving behind, or attempting to, a barbarous institution that had blighted the lives of millions. Such a thing should be celebrated far and wide, writes Gordon-Reed. What's more, while she sees that, quote, twinge of possessiveness that she felt over Juneteenth as coming from the very Texas, quote, habit of seeing my home state and the people who reside there as special, she now celebrates the fact that, quote, rather than keeping the holiday to ourselves, Texans have been in the forefront of trying to make Juneteenth a national holiday. Now that effort, so it seems, is about to bear fruit. And it reminds us that while General Grant's proclamation of absolute equality was aspirational then, and that it's closer to reality now than it was on that day of freedom from slavery back in 1865, still today in 2021, it remains an aspiration to be striven for. Now, here's some of the things that when I hit the books, I came across to tell me a little bit more about both the history of slavery in Texas and Juneteenth in Texas, and then also how it came to be up here. Well, up there, I'm in Tennessee right now, but up there in the Tri-Cities where I'm from, as you all are. So here's some of the things I've read. You can read them too if you so choose, and I'm happy to entertain questions if you've got them.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Go ahead, Ron.
Dr. Mitchell, I understand now a lot better why the 1st of January, 1863, the day of the Emancipation Proclamation, was not as an emotionally important day as June 19th. I think that was a really kind of a personalized and emotional statement from that general that made things happen. Why was not the 1st of January ever celebrated nationwide?
Well, 1st of January, of course, already has some other associations. It's New Year's Day. It does actually wind up having some, that day in 1863, having some celebrations on it. A lot of enslaved persons haven't heard about the proclamation, and though they still remain in slavery, of course, the only ones emancipated by it are areas still occupied by the Confederacy. And so they're going to remain in bondage. They're in bondage on December 31st. They're still going to be in bondage in January 1st. Practically speaking, the Confederacy is still in charge where they're at. And nonetheless, they gathered in the slave quarters on various plantations and so on. And they did have a celebration of that night, called it night, and stayed up and waited and watched for the stroke. And even though their practical circumstances didn't necessarily change all that much at the stroke of midnight on the 1st of January, 1863, the symbolic importance of Abraham Lincoln's proclamation. They celebrated that even though it didn't make all that much practical difference to their circumstances at the time. And that said, the other thing that the proclamation was about was encouraging enslaved persons to walk off the plantations where they were enslaved, or to go and join the Union Army. And as I mentioned, 94,000 Black persons from the southern states did join the Union Army. So encouraging them that if they do resist their enslavement in new ways, unaccustomed ways, desert the plantations, join the army, whatever have you, that would be honored. Their status would be the status no longer of enslaved persons, but of free persons, if they were willing to do that.
Okay. Do you have any other questions? Let me change my view here so I can see.
I do have a question. Are you related to C.J. Mitchell?
He's my grandfather.
Great. Great man.
May I have a follow-on question?
Yes.
And Ron, if you don't mind, when you ask your question and then mute yourself, we're getting a lot of feedback in it. Took away the audio from Dr.
I will.
Okay, thank you.
So, Dr. Mitchell, when the slaves were released, or crossed over to the lines and joined the Union Army, there was almost 100,000, and the North was actually running short of soldiers and troops. Did that 100,000 black soldiers make a big difference in the ending of the war?
I would say that they did. And I mean, if we kind of think about it in terms of the black population of the United States at that time, it's about 4 million. So you're talking about roughly about 5% of the population. And that's even when you take into account women and children. So about 5% of the black population of the United States did enlist. Do I have that math right? I believe I do, yeah. And that's roughly the same, or maybe a little bit more than the proportion of white residents of the northern states, of the Union states, that participated in the Union Army. Probably pretty comparable with how many white Southerners participated in the Confederate Army. Now, the North did have an absolute advantage in manpower, of course. But I would have to say that, yes, these black soldiers did make a significant difference. In fact, one historian, Steve Hahn, who was actually at the University of Pennsylvania when I was there, but he's written in one of his books that one way to think about black participation in the Army and the Civil War is that it's the biggest slave rebellion in history.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell.
Yes, of course.
I have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you see any references to Thurgood Marshall, Supreme Court Justice, and his intervention with segregation in the Tri-Cities and property rights in the Tri-Cities?
Not when I was reading this material, but I think certainly Professor Bauman has written a bit about that. I referenced his article earlier. Let's see, where else? And I mean, a comprehensive history, an academic history of the black community in the Tri-Cities has yet to be written. I hope someone will. I don't know. Maybe I end up having to do it myself. We'll see. But yeah, definitely national figures. One story that Professor Bauman tells in his article is that Hazel Scott, who is an African-American singer and also the wife of Congressman Adam Clayton Powell from New York City. So one of the earliest black congressmen in the 20th century. So his wife, she's a performer. She's performing in the Northwest, passes through Pasco, not allowed to eat in a particular establishment. And so that focused some attention, this is about 1950, I believe it was, so some attention on the Tri-Cities and the situation here. And of course, in those years, the city of Kennewick didn't allow black residents at all back in those days, had a sundown law that said that black persons had to leave town before the sun would set. I believe that was the case until the late 1960s. So definitely intervention from outside was a big part in changing that. I know also from the book by Kate Brown, Plutopia, that the employment at Hanford was, it wasn't technically segregated, it wasn't explicitly segregated, but in terms of who it was that was more or less able to go for this job or that job, there was kind of de facto segregation in that. At one point in time, the Seattle Urban League and the NAACP here in the Northwest, they kind of get together, look at the situation at Hanford and say, well, there's got to be some folks you can find, some black folks who can do some of these jobs that among other things, would allow them to rent housing in the city of Richland from the lead contractor there that, of course, in those days, as we mostly all know here, owned all the housing in Richland before about 1958. And so I'm looking for some folks, did find some folks, among them my grandfather, C.J. Mitchell, and they moved into the city of Richland. That's actually told. And Kate Brown, who's actually a professor out in Maryland, she actually interviewed my grandfather for a chapter of that book called Utopia.
Thank you. Yes, I had seen something on the local PBS about this, and it did feature Hazel Scott and talked about Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheetah.
Thank you for coming and joining today. Sorry for my naive question, but how does the story of the Underground Railroad tie to all that you've been talking about today? Is it around the same time? Is it before?
I mean, that I'm able to say less about, I'm afraid. I know that the Underground Railroad, because of recent books, recent television shows, movies, very much a topic on people's minds. Definitely there'd be connections to it. The Underground Railroad, of course, this network of people, not literally a railroad, not literally underground, but a network of people who clandestinely tried to assist enslaved persons in heading northwards, which mostly meant to Canada. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 made it necessary for state authorities, even in free states, to assist in returning escaped slaves to their enslavement. So folk had to go to Canada. Underground Railroad had to change its operations up and move people to Canada. Now you can expect that not a whole lot of people made it to safety from Texas heading northward. I can say, though, that particularly in the borderlands, to the south and west of the Nueces River, the area between there and the Rio Grande River, which then is now the border between Texas and northern Mexico, quite a number of enslaved persons did escape southward from the Texas borderlands into Mexico, and found freedom there. So that's perhaps one connection we can make there. Now, I'd want to ask a question. I see my Uncle Leonard on the call here, and I wonder, do you know, when was Juneteenth first a thing here in the Tri-Cities?
I do believe, I don't know the exact date, but it was in the 70s. I believe it was in the 70s.
Okay.
Started. And some of your relatives were real instrumental on starting that. That would be Vanis Daniels, Edmund Daniels, and Vanis Sr., Willie Daniels.
And a lot of the names,
among others.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Among others, but that would be the closest connection to our family.
And a lot of the names that my uncle's mentioning, Vanis Daniels, Willie Daniels, Edmund Daniels, and then also C.J. Mitchell, I know that Grandpa also was interviewed by the local PBS affiliate. So a lot of those interviews, the video of those is actually available. You can go hunt them up on the PBS website, and check out what they had to say about their experiences here in the Tri-Cities in the early days.
There is also a series through WSU, the Hanford History Project, that has a lot of interviews that Dr. Bauman and had a lot to do with. Also, he has a couple books out that have some information.
I actually was asked to help teach a class, give a couple of guest lectures in a class at Columbia Basin College back in January. And once upon a time, I did actually do some teaching there full-time. Okay, not full, part-time myself, about 15 years ago or so. But, I still got some connections there. One of them, Dave Arnold, asked me if I'd assist in the class he was teaching on African-American cultures, if I could say a little bit about slavery and the slave trade. And Professor Bowman also gave a talk in Dave Arnold's class. I got a chance to hear that as well. After I'd given my lectures, a couple of days later, he gave his. Got to hear what he had to say as well. And he talked about having interviewed Grandpa.
Mike.
Yeah, Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much for today. I kind of wanted to circle back on Ron's question about, why January 1st, the Emancipation Proclamation 2.5 years earlier wasn't celebrated as much. And Ron, you mentioned the emotionalism of General Granger's, or the more greater importance of that. I know we kind of touched on it, but it's sort of a subtle thing that I'd like to point out with my kids, and I'm not sure it's really come out really strong, is that we touched on the fact that there was still slavery in the northern border states, and I don't think anyone in good conscience could get to a point of celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation by itself, wherein by what it didn't say, it retained slavery in the northern states that were part of the fight. A lot of folks don't understand that Lincoln had a grand plan. Everyone who's read all the books on Lincoln, the man said things on the campaign trail, and while he was in office, that would not think that he was on a grand scheme to release all slaves in the United States. But history shows that as he gained more and more power and more ability to do what he wanted, that's exactly where he was going. And you might even say he was sort of on a Moses complex in a way. But the Emancipation Proclamation pretty much reinforced the institution of slavery in the northern border states to retain that support to continue to fight the war against the South. And so there was really no point to celebrate, I think, until General Granger's proclamation came out.
Yeah,
I don't think in good conscience you could have.
Yeah, I think certainly with hindsight, that's how we would see it. As I said at the top of the talk, practically speaking, the Emancipation Proclamation in the short term didn't free any slaves at all. So kind of John's saying about the border states, and they're left out of this. Kentucky, slaves there are still slaves. Emancipation
Maryland,
nothing about that. Slaves in Maryland, and of course that gets back to the Emancipation Proclamation being basically a war measure. In two ways. One is Britain and France. They South's angling for diplomatic recognition from them. But once it becomes a war over slavery, they can, in good conscience, recognize or intervene on the side of the Confederacy. Both made very public commitments. So that's one side of it. The other side is encouraging enslaved persons to resist their slavery. Knowledge that the United States government would, to at least to some extent, back them in their resistance against slavery. And of course, that's basically a strike at the Southern home front. The South had a real manpower problem, right? The South had a real, you should say, people power problem, because to a great extent, as you've got Southern men going to join the army at the front line, a lot of the home front has to be held down by men beyond military age or men before military age, always. And so as a result, and of course, what they're trying to hold down is an inherently hostile population. So the Lincoln, through the Emancipation Proclamation, and people hear about it. Enslaved persons hear about it. Enslaved people in Texas probably heard about it, almost certainly heard about it. And it gave them that much more of an incentive to resist against their enslavement, which is being enforced not by men of military age, but by others, because the men of military age are off at the front. But it's a war measure, and for Lincoln, he doesn't want to offend the sentiments of slaveholders in Kentucky and East Tennessee, which is largely Unionist territory, invaded pretty quickly at the beginning of the war. Funny thing he said, interesting thing he said, and of course, Lincoln was born in Kentucky.
I understand.
Jeff Davis, president of the Confederacy, also born in Kentucky.
Yep, goodbye.
And Lincoln once said towards the outset of the war that, well, I hope that I have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky on my side. Definitely the same way about Maryland. If they'd lost Maryland, they'd have had to abandon the District of Columbia. But Maryland, another slave state, but another border state that remains with the Union. Frederick Douglass really does do a lot to push Abraham Lincoln towards a much fuller conception, not just of emancipation. There are lots of folks who are in favor of emancipation, provided that freed people were then repatriated to Africa. But by the time of his second inaugural speech in 1865, the one that's enshrined in the wall of the Lincoln Memorial, at that point in time, Lincoln saying, we're going to bring in formerly enslaved persons as citizens of this country. Now, how might that have been if a man who was in attendance at that speech, a man called John Wilkes Booth, decided to take direct action against Lincoln as a result of that speech?
Do we have time for one more question?
Sure, just you, Ron. One more question, and then we'll bring
Okay.
closure.
Dr. Mitchell, would you correct me if I'm wrong here? I just finished Lincoln's Gamble. You probably have read it.
I've not, actually.
It is a great story about the 6 months prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln sets out his legal basis for emancipation. And basically, he just doesn't say, okay, all you slaves are now free. He comes in from a legal basis. He is elected president. He is legally the commander-in-chief. And the slaves in the South are being used for war efforts, either in the war or sustaining the war. And so he says, in order to stop this war, and I intend to bring the two countries back together again, I make this martial decision, this war decision, that the property, which is the slave owners under the Dred Scott condition, horrible bill, now are free because they are part of the war effort, and we must stop the war. That's my reading of this new book, Lincoln's Gamble. Does that fit with what you believe?
I think that is correct. I mean, of course, back in those days, the executive power of the presidency had not been stretched then as far as it has been now. No matter what the Confederates said on the question, they all said, "Oh, that Lincoln, he's such a tyrant." But of course, this was a war measure. This was not a law. The Emancipation Proclamation was not a law passed by Congress. It was a military order, handed down by President Lincoln in his capacity as commander-in-chief. That's absolutely right. And I mean, in the dispatches that you have from guys like William Tecumseh Sherman, he's marching through Georgia. He's got his persons flocking to his army. He's got this logistical problem of, okay, how does he feed these people who are following along after him? How does he look after their needs? Is that even his responsibility? So when he gives that order number 15 and orders they be given 40 acres and a mule from those lands that were confiscated from enslavers, when he ordered that, that's basically just a thing of, okay, this is what we have to do in order to deal with the military problem posed by these people following after the army. So often you see in the dispatches, military dispatches, enslaved under the Union Army. For instance, Louisiana, after Benjamin Butler invades there in 1862, New Orleans early on in the war, and he talks about, okay, this is going to be our military policy towards contrabands. These are people who are held as property, of course, by Southern enslavers. In Northern military parlance, they're referred to as contraband war. Used by the enemy and confiscated by the Northern Army. So it's all the way. It's a military order, the Emancipation Proclamation, and it's there for a military purpose. So too was General Granger's order. I mean, it's really the 13th Amendment that fully does the job. And of course, you can see just how much trouble it actually was getting that through even a Congress with no Southerners in it. You can see that in Steven Spielberg's movie.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
We very much appreciate